oaths and to secret proceedings.
I think a new world order is emerging.
An inside job? How dare you? How dare you?
To create, so to say, mass-produced models of human beings arranged in some kind of a scientific caste system.
We shall go on to the end. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall never surrender.
Good day, everybody. This is UCY.tv. It's the 3rd of September 2016. I'm your host, Walter Hendricks, coming to you from Holland, where it is 4 p.m. It's 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and this is called the Solvinur Event. Good morning, everybody. Welcome in the chat. Hold on, guys. You can via UCY.tv. There's a couple of people there already. Captain Gringo, Del, Nick, Dan Defiant, Grump, Jane, Jules, Matty Clues, Otto, and 3 unknowns. What's up, everybody? How you doing? You can call in 718-717-8296. 718-717-8296. I got that phone number in my head, you know, it's so strange, like numbers I can remember. I even remember my old telephone number in Canada, 2717164. I mean, it's so strange, like names, I could like forget that in like seconds. That's so amazing. Yeah, especially when I'm trying to do some research and I'm trying to find, what's his name? What's Graham Hancock? Yeah, that's the guy. Yeah. Not so nice. So what do you guys want to talk about before I do indeed step into Chapter 17 of Brave New World, because we are going to finish that at some point. So, remember, this is time for you guys. You get the chance to take over the airwaves. You can also do that via Skype. You can contact me at Solvinur, SOLVINUR. And for Neo. Or like call in 718-717-8296. So I've been digging a little bit deeper into the history that goes beyond like 2,000 years ago, and it seems that the timing gets a little strange. And I noticed this first at school. a long time ago, they would tell us that about 5,000 years ago, we were still, kind of like hunting and gathering. And then, a couple of lessons later, they would introduce you to the pyramids of Giza and tell you, well, this is about 4,500 years ago. And I was like, okay, and who built that stuff? It kind of didn't make sense to me. That these hunter-gatherers would like be able to, make this kind of structure like that. So there's people like John Anthony West, which places the construction of this pyramid at 36,000 years ago, which is due to his analysis of the Sphinx, which he, in my opinion, correctly ties to the astrological sign of Leo. Just like the pyramids there close to it are tied to Orion and Sirius, these Earth-based megalithic structures seem to have a tendency to tie themselves to heavenly bodies, stars in the sky, signs. And it's a way in which you can tell in what time period these structures must have been built. And these are time periods of thousands of years. So if you go back to the time when the Leo would be looking at its own sign, and the shafts from the pyramids would be looking at Orion and Sirius, the time clock would go back to 10,500 years ago, right? And the problem with that is that was the ending of the last ice age, in which there were two big meltdowns that are still unexplained, how that all that meltwater appeared, and a later smaller one. So two big ones and a small melting period, which are most likely responsible for some of the flood myths that are out there. And they also mention Plato's account of Atlantis, and then they say that it's a myth. Okay, I'm not a fan of Plato, but how dare you even, I would say, call it a myth? He's this authority on all this other field. If you talk about philosophy, then they bend to their knees and bow in reverence, so to speak, right? But when he says something that doesn't compute for them or something, or they can't accept it for one reason or another, then all of a sudden what Plato says is a myth. When he gives even 3 times, I think it is, it's in the Critias and the Timaeus that he speaks about this. 3 times he gives a date for this. And it happens to coincide with the ending of the last ice age. It's a story that he got from, I don't know who he personally got it from, but it got there via Solon, who was in exile in Egypt, and got it from the priest there. This Atlantis story. right? So, if you give that detailed source material and a detailed description of the landscapes as opposed to as we're supposed to, this Atlantis was supposed to be, then I would take his account above any of the accounts that we've heard the last couple of 4 decades or so about the location of Atlantis being all over the place except for where Plato says, right? So, because these two heavy melt periods and floods, it seems unlikely, according to John, that this was built in the last Leo age, right? We're going to Aquarius now, remember? But that it was a Leo age before that, and that's about 36 years, I should say, ago. So, it's difficult. But so far, I'm inclined to agree with Anthony, John Anthony West, that is. I had him on the show once. If you type in the YouTube Solvinur and John Anthony West, you can hear him speak for about 2 hours or so. Nice man. Yep. Also Robert Schoch. Check him out also, in case you're interested in this kind of stuff. Robert Schoch. It's SHOSCH. Blah blah. Nothing going on in the chat, you guys. Well, not much anyway. Earthquakes. Well, if you guys don't want to take over the airwaves, I'm going to read Brave New World, So you better call in fast, 718-717-8296. Or contact me at Solvinur, that's SOLVINUR, via Skype. I hope you all have something to drink. My coffee, yeah. I don't know, Jules, if you're listening, but if you insist, I will tell you the story that I told you about, which was too long to type in the chat room. Yeah. So, looking back on this whole digging into what happened so many thousands of years ago, at some point I'm like, okay, what's the difference, right? At this point, what difference does it make, right? Yeah. Yeah. It might be to some people an opening, like 9/11 was for me. Because if you dig deep enough into this stuff and you find out that the Egyptian government is barring just about everybody from doing any investigations at all, and this has nothing to do with that they're afraid that they're gonna break things or something, because the equipment today is technically so advanced that we don't even need to touch the stuff, you know. So there's lots of investigations that can be done to the chamber beneath the paws of the Sphinx, for instance. Right? So why isn't that allowed? Why are these so-called Egyptology, these quackademics, as John West calls them, why is it that these people are so stubborn? Why don't they just look at the facts and accept? Normally they are trained to do this, right? They are trained to accept authority, right? So along comes this authority on weathering, and he tells them that this is from rainfall, and this rain, it didn't happen at 5,000 years ago. So the structure in which the Sphinx is standing, it's been chalked out of the earth, so to speak. I think it's limestone, not sure. It shows weathering. Robert Schoch, he is an expert on this stuff. He studied for this years and years. But the Egyptologists, they just deny this for some reason or another. They don't want to look at it. Why is that? It's like a thread that if you start pulling at it, all of a sudden you find other points, and you start pulling there, and next thing you know, the whole carpet is falling apart. In other words, your whole worldview has fallen apart. And I think this is true for many fields that one could do research in, whether it's medical or science or religion. I would even say philosophy. I think even though I call myself a philosopher, it has been used to control people. Right? I think that's what a lot of it is about. Plato is one of the worst ones, as far as I'm concerned, with his world of forms. I mean, I understand where he's coming from. The fact, for instance, that I talked about a couple of broadcasts ago about these proportions that you can find in the solar system. And these same proportions you find on Earth and in animals. And, I can understand where he gets his idea of forms from. But it's so out of the blue. And later, I think it was later, I'm not quite sure if, I'm not a student of Plato, so I'm not sure, but you get personifications, and you get this God-like idea. Christianity has tried to implement Plato's ideas also. Not quite sure who that was, but I think it was somewhere around the 15th century. I don't know exactly the date, but it's mystical, right? And we and especially me as a materialist, so to speak, still, more or less, we find it hard to accept these stories that you get from legends that in thousands and thousands of years ago there were people living in a golden age, as they say. They compute these yugas in the Bhagavad Gita, for instance. Remember that 432 number? In this case, the add 3 zeros and then just double it to 864, and add another 432, and you get these periods of numbers, which are periods of numbers. The word period implies the word time, right? These yugas are about time, and they claim that it's a cycle, and that it starts at a golden age, and then it turns into a silver age, and then it turns into a bronze age, and then at last you have the iron age. And supposedly, if they start using these Vedic texts as a source, okay, well, then according to the Vedas, we are in the Iron Age at the moment. Where supposedly things are supposed to be as bad as they can get. Now, apparently, these ages seem to, flow over into one another, and to some, according to some, this last age has only begun about 5,000 to 7,000 years ago. So we might have something left from the Bronze Age still, but the prediction is that it's going to get worse and worse and worse, and so much darkness that the Dark Ages are an enlightenment compared, right? That's the idea of these cycles. And I think that's dogmatic, I think that's... it doesn't make sense. I'd rather much go with, and I'm not saying that, his word is impeccable or something, but I find his theory much more compelling, that human society, or quote-unquote society, human people have risen to heights before, but that meteorites or comets or debris from comets messed things up for us, because these things have a tremendous effect on the climate, and your food will not grow for years, and you get starving people, and then a disease comes in, and poof, we lose half of the people. And in those kinds of situations, you're not going to be able to build pyramids. Did you know that, like, last week we had another near miss? This thing went closer than the moon. And, fortunately it wasn't that big. But, it's getting... we've had many near misses the last couple of years. This is not the first time that you hear, it's a meteor about to hit. And maybe it's fear-mongering, I don't know. But, they used to teach us at school that space was fracking empty. But if you look at what NASA is showing, it's filled with garbage out there. The person from the meteorites is, by the way, Randall Carlson, who also explains about the Kuiper belt, which is very interesting. It's like this belt that's around the sun at the outer edges, beyond Neptune and Jupiter and beyond those planets. But sometimes this belt is full of asteroids, big rocks, size of cars, but also mountains, small mountains maybe, right? And these things are circling around the sun, but sometimes an alignment of planets can influence the quote-unquote orbit of this piece of junk, so to speak. This, well, let's call it a rock, right? When, for instance, the planets are in front and this piece of rock is influenced by it, then this piece of rock will pick up speed because it's being pulled along by the gravity of the two planets, the two outer planets combined. If the rock is in front of it, then it might slow down, right? And if it slows down, it enters into a quote-unquote orbit that is closer to the sun. And it can then be picked up by Jupiter, for instance, which will swing it either way back or whatever direction, or let it smash into it. Or Jupiter can swing it even further into the inner planets, to Mars and Earth. And that's actually the idea where panspermia came from, if I'm not mistaken. Because these rocks contain elements that are needed for the creation of DNA. And it's kind of odd, says Randall Carlson, that it is that way because it seems like these planets are in such positions and have such gravity that this can actually happen. All right. I don't suppose anybody is listening for the first time, but if you are, you should check out the Trivium. That's Trivium. Triviumeducation.com is a good site to begin. It's this is how your mind works, right? And since most of the people are under mind control, suffer from mind control, it's because they don't understand how their own mind works. So that's important that you check that out if you haven't yet. So triviumeducation.com. You can also just go to YouTube and type in Trivium. You will get a lot of videos with people from Tragedy and Hope and Gino Denning and John Irvin and others that have discussed this for hours and hours, and it takes that much time. It does. So I think that's one of the most important quote-unquote material things one should be aware of. And of course it's a fracking shame that this isn't being taught at school anymore. The other thing I would consider important does tie back to what also shimmers through from these ancient cultures that I've been trying to get some more information from, like the Dogon, for instance. And they seem to have let's call them religious ideas. I don't have a better word for them. You know, maybe these Egyptians didn't have a word, religion, you know, but they have these stories about Isis and Osiris and Horus and so on, and about the moon. And I'm thinking that we shouldn't be so arrogant as to say that these are not important. I think those cultures, or what, maybe they didn't even think of themselves as cultures, maybe that's just a Western idea that has been baked into our brains. Right? So maybe these ancient people knew more than we give them credit for, right? And most of them have, let's say, a spiritual message, right? In the Egyptians, it's about what happens after death. And it's claimed by some people that this blue lotus which you can also find back in the art that is left from these people, was used as a drug to entice visions of the afterworld, and that's where they got their information from, and that's how they made these elaborate drawings of what happens after death, all these stages that you go through, right? And so I think that is indeed one of the more important topics, because you live your life here, and it's what is it 100 years, all right? So compared to the life of the earth, that's nothing. It's less than a blink of the eye. It's too small, right? It's not enough. 100 years is just not enough, so to speak, to be of any significance, right? And since I told you before about teleology, difficult word, from telos, to do with quote unquote the end, but not so negative, but more like a purpose, right? The goal, right? So teleologically speaking, it doesn't make sense that in this short lifetime that you've been given, that you're supposed to reach your teleological goal. On the other hand, it might also be very arrogant for people to think that their life has meaning. I'm serious about that. It could be very arrogant. Who knows? But I think it's worth investigating, because you don't know what happens when you die. You just don't know. How would you know? So that's where I think these older people may have insights that we as Westerners in our material world, we wouldn't even dream of them. Jeez, you people in the chat are quiet. Alright, so chapter 17. We're going to start this. Who knows if we'll end it today. If you want to barge in, 718-717-8296. Chapter 17. Let me adjust this a little bit. Art, science. You seem to have paid a fairly high price for your happiness, said the savage, when they were alone. Anything else? Well, religion, of course, replied the controller. There used to be something called God before the 9 Years' War. But I was forgetting. You know all about God, I suppose. Well, the savage hesitated. He would have liked to say something about solitude, about night, about the mesa lying pale under the moon, about the precipice, the plunge into shadowy darkness, about death. He would have liked to speak, but there were no words, not even in Shakespeare. The controller, meanwhile, had crossed to the other side of the room and was unlocking a large safe set into the wall between the bookshelves. The heavy door swung open. Rummaging in the darkness within, "It's a subject," he said, "that has always had a great interest for me." He pulled out a thick, black volume. "You've never read this, for example?" The savage took it. "The Holy Bible," containing the Old and New Testaments. He read aloud from the title page. Nor this, it was a small book and had lost its cover. The Imitation of Christ. Nor this, he handed out another volume. The Varieties of Religious Experience by William James. And I've got plenty more, Mustafa Mond continued, resuming his seat. A whole collection of pornographic old books. God in the safe and Ford on the shelves. He pointed with a laugh to his avowed library, to the shelves of books, the rack full of reading machine bobbins and soundtrack rolls. But if you know about God, why don't you tell them? Asked the savage indignantly. Why don't you give them these books about God? For the same reason as we don't give them Othello. They're old. They're about God hundreds of years ago, not about God now. But God doesn't change. Men do, though. What difference does that make? All the difference in the world, said Mustafa Mond. He got up again and walked to the safe. There was a man called Cardinal Newman, he said. A cardinal, he explained parenthetically, was a kind of arch-community songster. I, Pandulf, of fair Milan, cardinal. I've read about them in Shakespeare. Of course you have. Well, as I was saying, there was a man called Cardinal Newman. Ah, here's the book. He pulled it out. And while I'm about it, I'll take this one too. It's by a man called Maine de Biran. He was a philosopher, if you know what that was. A man who dreams of fewer things than there are heaven and earth, said the savage promptly. Quite so. I'll read you one of the things he did dream of in a moment. Meanwhile, listen to what this old arch-community songster said. He opened the book at the place marked by a slip of paper and began to read. We are not our own anymore. Then what we possess is our own. We did not make ourselves. We cannot be supreme over ourselves. We are not our own masters. We are God's property. It is not our happiness thus to view the matter. Is it any happiness or any comfort to consider that we are our own? This is strange. It may be thought so by young and prosperous. They may think it a great thing to have everything, as they suppose, their own way, to depend on no one, to have to think of nothing out of sight, to be without the irksomeness of continual acknowledgement, continual prayer, continual reference of what they do to the will of another. But as time goes on, they, as all men, will find that independence was not made for man, that it is an unnatural state. Yeah. Is that, that's what this is a lot of about also, right? Independence was not made for man, that's the point here. Which of course is ridiculous. I mean, if you look in nature, there's not one that cannot take care of itself. The birds can eat the fruits from the trees, the fish can eat bigger fish. The ants are very busy, the bees find many flowers. I mean, every living creature knows what to do, right? And they know how to breed also. right? They seem to be totally independent. They don't seem to need a police telling them what to do, right? Yet for humans, somehow, we are exempt. We don't belong to that group or something. We can't take care of ourselves, or for some strange reason. Therefore, we cannot be independent, according to whoever. That's the idea, right? That's the whole belief in authority, I suppose, one could say. So, makes no sense. Continuing. Will do for a while, but not carry us on safely to the end. Will do for a while, but will not carry us on safely to the end. What end is he talking about? Mustafa Mond paused, put down the first book and, picking up the other, turned over the pages. Take this, for example, he said, and in his deep voice once more began to read. A man grows old. He feels in himself that radical sense of weakness, of listlessness, of discomfort which accompanies the advance of age, and, feeling thus, imagines himself merely sick, lulling his fears with the notion that this distressing condition is due to some particular cause, from which, as from an illness, he hopes to recover. Vain imaginings. That sickness is old age, and it's a horrible disease. They say that it is the fear of death, and of what comes after death, that makes men turn to religion as they advance in years. Yeah. Ties a little bit to what I was talking about before I began reading, right? So I don't think religion, which is of course a very loaded and wrongly word, I guess spirituality would be the better word, but I'm not opponent of that word either. Anyway, it's not from fear that this comes. It comes from looking at the sky at night, like our ancestors did. That's where it comes from. But my own experience has given me the conviction that, quite apart from any such terrors or imaginings, the religious sentiment tends to develop as we grow older. To develop because, as the passions grow calm, as the fancy of sensibilities are less excited and less excitable, our reason becomes less troubled in its workings, less obscured by the images, desires, and distractions, in which it used to be absorbed, whereupon God emerges as from behind a cloud. Our soul feels, sees, turns towards the source of all light, turns naturally and inevitably, for now that all that gave to the world of sensation its life and charms has begun to leak away from us. Now the phenomenal existence is no more bolstered up by impressions from within or from without. We feel the need to lean on something that abides, something that will never play us false, a reality, an absolute and everlasting truth. Yes, we inevitably turn to God, for this religious sentiment is of its nature so pure, so delightful to the soul that experiences it, that it makes up for all of our other losses. Right? So there's the total opposite of the point that I got from reading the last couple of sentences here. First you get the I guess I would call it the material side of things, and this is more the dogmatic side of things, right? or the, maybe not dogmatic, maybe the mystic side of it. Continuing, Mustafa Mons shut the book and leaned back in his chair. One of the numerous things in heaven and earth that these philosophers didn't dream about was this. He waved his hand. Us, the modern world. You can only be independent of God while you've got youth and prosperity. Independence won't take you safely to the end. What end? Well, we've now got youth and prosperity right up to the end. What follows? Evidently, that we can be independent of God. The religious sentiment will compensate us for all our losses. But there aren't any losses for us to compensate. Religious sentiment is superfluous. And why should we go hunting for a substitute for youthful desires when youthful desires never fail? A substitute for distractions when we go on enjoying all the old fooleries to the very last. What need have we of repose when our minds and bodies continue to delight in activity? Of consolation when we have soma? Of something immovable when there is social order? Then you think there is no God? No, I think there quite probably is one. Then why? Mustafa Mons checked him. But he manifests himself in different ways to different men. In pre-modern times he manifested himself as the being that's described in these books. Now, how does he manifest himself now? Asked the savage. Well, he manifests himself as an absence, as though he weren't there at all. That's your fault. Call it the fault of civilization. God isn't compatible with machinery and scientific medicine and universal happiness. You must make your choice. Our civilization has chosen machinery and medicine and happiness. That's why I have to keep these books locked up in the safe. They're smut. People would be shocked. The savage interrupted him. But isn't it natural to feel there's a God? You might as well ask if it's natural to do up one's trousers with zippers, said the controller sarcastically. You remind me of another of those old fellows called Bradley. He defined philosophy as the finding of bad reason for what one believes by instinct. As if one believed anything by instinct. One believes things because one has been conditioned to believe them. Finding bad reasons for what one believes for other bad reasons, that's philosophy. People believe in God because they've been conditioned to. Yeah, so how far is that true for people today? Your average Christian and your average Hindu, and how far have they been conditioned into believing in God? You're born, say you're born in India, you're born in a Sudra caste, and your parents they have a statue of Shiva in their bedroom and in their kitchen and everywhere else, in the closets, everywhere you turn. You're confronted with these images and stories of ancient gods, and are you then conditioned to believe in God? Continuing. But all the same, insisted the savage, is it natural to believe in God when you're alone, quite alone, in the night, thinking about death? But people never are alone now, said Mustafa Mond. We make them hate solitude, as we arrange their lives so that it's almost impossible for them ever to have it. The savage nodded gloomily. At Malpais he had suffered because they had shut him out from the communal activities of the Pueblo. In civilized London he was suffering because he could never escape from those communal activities, never be quietly alone. Do you remember that bit in King Lear? Said the savage at last. The gods are just, and of our pleasant vices make instruments to plague us. The dark and vicious place where he got cost him his eyes. No idea, guys, what that was, but that's what it says here. And Edmund answers, you remember, he's wounded, he's dying. Thou hast spoken right. 'Tis true. The wheel has come full circle. I'm here. What about that now? Doesn't there seem to be a God managing things, punishing, rewarding? Well, does there? Questioned the controller in his turn. You can indulge in any number of pleasant vices with a free martin, and run no risk of having your eyes put out by your son's mistress. The wheel has come full circle. I'm here. But where would Edmund be nowadays? Sitting in a pneumatic chair, with his arm round a girl's waist, sucking away at his sex hormone chewing gum, and looking at the feelies. The gods are just, no doubt, but their code of law is dictated, in the last resort, by the people who organize society. Providence takes its cue from men. Are you sure? Asked the savage. Are you quite sure that the Edmund in that pneumatic chair hasn't been just as heavily punished as the Edmund who's wounded and bleeding to death? The gods are just. Haven't they used his pleasant vices as an instrument to degrade him? Degrade him from what position? As a happy, hard-working, good-consuming citizen, he's perfect. Of course. If you choose some other standard than ours, then perhaps you might say he was degraded. But you've got to stick to one set of postulates. You can't play electromagnetic golf according to the rules of centrifugal bumblepuppy. But value dwells not in particular will, said the savage. It holds his estimate and dignity as well, wherein 'tis precise of itself, as in the prizer. Come, come, protested Mustafa Mond, that's growing rather far, isn't it? If you allowed yourself to think of God, you wouldn't allow yourselves to be degraded by pleasant vices. You'd have a reason for bearing things patiently, for doing things with courage. I've seen it with the Indians. I'm sure you have, said Mustafa Mond. But then we aren't Indians. There isn't any need for a civilized man to bear anything that's seriously unpleasant. And as for doing things, Ford forbid that he should get the idea into his head. It would upset the whole social order if men started doing things on their own. What about self-denial then? If you had a God, you'd have a reason for self-denial. But industrial civilization is only possible when there's no self-denial. Self-indulgence up to the very limits imposed by hygiene and economics, otherwise the wheel stopped turning. You'd have a reason for chastity, said the savage, blushing a little as he spoke the words. But chastity means passion. Chastity means neurasthenia. And passion and neurasthenia mean instability. And instability means the end of civilization. You can't have a lasting civilization without plenty of pleasant vices. But God's the reason for everything noble and fine and heroic. If you had a God, my dear young friend, said Mustafa Mond, civilization has absolutely no need or nobility or heroism. These things are symptoms of political inefficiency. In a properly organized society like ours, nobody has any opportunities for being noble or heroic. Conditions have got to be thoroughly unstable before the occasion can arise. Where there are wars, where there are divided allegiances, where there are temptations to be resisted, objects of love to be fought for and defended, there obviously nobility and heroism have some sense. But there aren't any wars nowadays. The greatest care is taken to prevent you from loving anyone too much. There's no such thing as a divided allegiance. You're so conditioned that you can't help doing what you ought to do. And what you ought to do is on the whole so pleasant, so many of the natural impulses are allowed free play, that there really aren't any temptations to resist. And if ever, by some unlucky chance, anything unpleasant should somehow happen, why, there's always Soma to give you a holiday from the facts. And there's always Soma to calm your anger, to reconcile you to your enemies, to make you patient and long-suffering. In the past, you could only accomplish these things by making a great effort and after a year of hard moral training. Now you swallow 2 or 3 half-gram tablets and there you are. Anybody can be virtuous now. You can carry at least half your mortality about in a bottle. Christianity without tears, that's what Soma is. But the tears are necessary. Don't you remember what Othello said? If after every tempest came such calms, may the winds blow till they have wakened death. There is a story one of the old Indians used to tell us about the girl of Mataski. The young man who wanted to marry her had to do a morning's hoeing in her garden. It seemed easy, but there were flies and mosquitoes, magic ones. Most of the young men simply couldn't stand the biting and stinging, but the one that could, he got the girl. Charming, but in civilized countries, said the controller, you can have girls without hoeing for them. And there aren't any flies or mosquitoes to sting you. We got rid of them all centuries ago. The savage nodded, frowning. You got rid of them. Yes, that's just like you. Getting rid of everything unpleasant instead of learning to put up with it. Whether it is better in the mind to suffer with slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against the sea of troubles and by opposing end them. But you don't do either, neither suffer nor oppose. You just abolish the slings and arrows. It's too easy. He was silent, thinking of his mother. In her room on the 37th floor, Linda had floated in a sea of singing lights and perfumed caresses, floated away out of space, out of time, out of the prison of her memories, her habits, her aged and bloated body. And Tomakin, ex-director of hatcheries and conditioning, Tomakin was still on holiday from humiliation and pain, in a world where you could not hear those words, that derisive laughter, could not see that hideous face, feel those moist and flabby arms around his neck, in a beautiful world. What you need, the savage went on, is something with tears for a change. Nothing costs enough here. $12.5 million, Henry Foster had protested when the savage told him that. 12.5 million. That's what the new conditioning center cost, not a cent less. Exposing what is mortal and unsure to all that fortune, death and danger there, even for an eggshell. Isn't there something in that? He asked, looking up at Mustafa Mond. Quite apart from God, though of course God would be a reason for it. Isn't there something in living dangerously? There's a great deal in it, the controller replied. Men and women must have their adrenals stimulated from time to time. What? Questioned the savage, uncomprehending. It's one of the conditions of perfect health. That's why we've made the VPS treatments compulsory. VPS? Violent Passion Surrogate. Regularly, once a month. We flood the whole system with adrenaline. It's the complete psychological equivalent of fear and rage. All the tonic effects of murdering Desdemona and being murdered by Othello without any of the inconveniences. But I like the inconveniences. We don't, said the controller. We prefer to do things comfortably. But I don't want comfort. I want God, I want poetry, I want real danger, I want freedom, I want goodness and I want sin. In fact, said Mustafa Mond, you're claiming the right to be unhappy. All right then, said the savage defiantly, I'm claiming the right to be unhappy. Not to mention the right to grow old and ugly and impotent, the right to have syphilis and cancer, the right to have too little to eat, the right to be lousy, the right to live in constant apprehension of what may happen tomorrow, the right to catch typhoid, the right to be tortured by unspeakable pains of every kind. There was a long silence. I claim them all, said the savage at last. Mustafa Mond shrugged his shoulders. You're welcome, he said. And that's the end of 17, guys. Moving on to 18. Let's see, let's roll a Siggy here. Let's see, we got one here. The website you can go to is ucy.tv. It's about 4 minutes past 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. It's Saturday, the 3rd of September 2016. And if you've noticed, there have been no ads at all, so check out the website ucy.tv, scroll down to the bottom, find that little donate button and help UCY out, if you can. You can call in, if you like, 718-717-8296, 718-717-8296. Or you can contact me at Skype, Solvinur, SOLVINUR, I, N from Neo, U, R. Alright, so we're doing last chapter here of Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. I'm not sure what we're gonna do after this. I do have a guest coming up the 24th, Melody Hallett. I was thinking of doing Brave New World Revisited, but I'm not sure about that. If you want anything, if you have a topic that you think like, well, that should be discussed, what you can do is either call in, of course, but you can also contact me at solvinur2@yahoo.com or at Facebook. You should find it at Solvinur, I'm guessing. Let's see what happens if you type that in. Yeah, I guess I'm the only Solvinur. At Facebook and at Twitter and at Steemit. There's my name, Solvinur. I took it. Nobody else can take it, I think. Don't think they allow that. Although I don't know anything about how all that works. Just Steemit. And I advise people to be careful with that. Alright. Moving on to chapter 18. The door was ajar. They entered. John! From the bathroom came an unpleasant and characteristic sound. Is there anything the matter? Helmholtz called. There was no answer. The unpleasant sound was repeated, twice. There was silence. Then, with a click, the bathroom door opened and, very pale, the savage emerged. I say, Helmholtz exclaimed solicitously. You look ill, John. Did you eat something that that didn't agree with you? Asked Bernard. The savage nodded. I ate civilization. What? It poisoned me. I was defiled. And then he added in a lower tone, I ate my own wickedness. Yes, but what exactly? I mean, just now you were... Now I'm purified, said the savage. I drank some mustard and warm water. The other stared at him in astonishment. Do you mean to say that you were doing it on purpose? Asked Bernard. That's how the Indians always purify themselves. He sat down and, sighing, passed his hand across his forehead. I shall rest for a few minutes, he said. I'm rather tired. Well, I'm not surprised, said Helmholtz after a silence. We've come to say goodbye. He went on in another tone. We're off tomorrow morning. Yes, we're off tomorrow, said Bernard, on whose face the savage remarked a new expression of determined resignation. And, by the way, John, he continued, leaning forward in his chair and laying a hand on the savage's knee, I want to say how sorry I am about everything that happened yesterday. He blushed. How ashamed, he went on, in spite of the unsteadiness of his voice. How really? The savage cut him short, and, taking his hand, affectionately pressed it. Helmholtz was wonderful to me, Bernard resumed after a little pause. If it hadn't been for him, I should... Now, Helmholtz protested. There was a silence. In spite of their sadness, because of it even, for their sadness was the symptom of their love for one another. The three young men were happy. I went to see the controller this morning, said the savage at last. What for? To ask if I mightn't go to the islands with you. And what did he say? Asked Helmholtz eagerly. The savage shook his head. He wouldn't let me. Why not? He said he wanted to go on with the experiment. But I'm damned, the savage added with a sudden fury. I'm damned if I'll go on being experimented with. Not for all the controllers in the world. I shall go away tomorrow too. But where? The others asked in unison. The savage shrugged his shoulders. Anywhere, I don't care, so long as I can be alone. From Guildford, the down line followed the Wey valley to Godalming, then over Milford and Whitley, proceeded to Halsemaire and on through Petersfield towards Portsmouth. Roughly parallel to it, the upline paced over Worplesdon, Tongham, Puttenham, Elstead and Greyshot. Between the Hog's Back and Hindhead there were points where the two lines were not more than 6 or 7 kilometers apart. The distance was too small for carless flyers, particularly at night when they had taken half a gram too much. There had been accidents, serious ones. It had been decided to deflect the upline a few kilometers to the west, between Greyshot and Tongham. 4 abandoned air lighthouses marked the course of the old Portsmouth to London road. The skies above them were silent and deserted. It was over Selborne, Borden and Farnham that the helicopters now ceaselessly hummed and roared. The savage had chosen as his hermitage the old lighthouse which stood on the crest on the hill between Puttenham and Elstead. The building was of ferro-concrete and in excellent condition, almost too comfortable, the savage had thought when he first explored the space, almost too civilizedly, luxurious. He pacified his conscience by promising himself a compensatingly harder self-discipline, purifications the more complete and thorough. His first night in the hermitage was, deliberately, a sleepless one. He spent the hours on his knees praying, now to that heaven from which the guilty Claudius had begged forgiveness, now in Zuni to Avonavilona, now to Jesus and Pocoon, now to his own guardian animal, the eagle. From time to time he stretched out his arms as though he went on the cross, and held them thus through long minutes of an ache that gradually increased till it became a tremulous and excruciating agony, held them in voluntary crucifixion, while he repeated, through clenched teeth, the sweat meanwhile pouring down his face, "Oh, forgive me! Oh, make me pure! Oh, help me be good!" again and again, till he was on the point of fainting from the pain. When morning came, he felt he had earned the right to inhabit the lighthouse. Yet, even though there still was glass in most of the windows, even though the view from the platform was so fine, for the very reason why he had chosen the lighthouse had become almost instantly a reason for going somewhere else. He had decided to live there because the view was so beautiful, because, from his vantage point, he seemed to be looking out on to the incarnation of a divine being. But who was he to be pampered with a daily and hourly sight of loveliness? Who was he to be living in the visible presence of God? All he deserved to do was live in some filthy sty, some blind hole in the ground, stiff and still aching after his long night of pain, but for that very reason, inwardly reassured, he climbed up the platform of his tower. He looked out over the bright sunrise world, which he had regained the right to inhabit. On the north the view was bounded by long chalk ridge of Hog's Back, from behind whose eastern extremity rose the towers of the 7 skyscrapers which constituted Guildford. Seeing them, the savage made a grimace, but he was to become reconciled to them in course of time, for at night they twinned, never heard of that word, twinned gaily with geometrical constellations, or else floodlighted, pointed their luminous fingers, with a gesture whose significance nobody in England but the savage now understood, solemnly towards the plumbless mysteries of heaven. In the valley he separated the Hog's Back from the sandy hill on which the lighthouse stood. Puttenham was a modest little village 9 stories high, with silos, a poultry farm and a small vitamin D factory. On the other side of the lighthouse, towards the south, the ground fell away in long slopes of heather to a chain of ponds. Beyond them, above the intervening woods, rose the 14-story tower of Elstead. Dim in the hazy English air, Hindhead and Selborne invited the eye into a blue romantic distance. But it was not alone the distance that had attracted the savage to his lighthouse. The near was as seductive as the far. The woods, the open stretches of heather and yellow gorse, the clumps of Scots firs, the shining ponds with their overhanging birch trees, their water lilies, their beds of rushes, these were beautiful and, to an eye accustomed to the aridities of the American desert, astonishing. And then the solitude. Whole days passed during which he never saw a human being. The lighthouse was only a quarter of an hour's flight from the Charing Tea Tower. But the hills of Malpais were hardly more deserted than this Surrey heath. The crowds that daily left London left it only to play electromagnetic golf or tennis. Puttenham possessed no links. The nearest Riemann surfaces were at Guildford. Flowers and the landscape were the only attractions here. And so, as there was no good reason for coming, nobody came. During the first day, the savage lived alone and undisturbed. Of the money which, on his first arrival, John had received for his personal expenses, most had been spent on his equipment. Before leaving London, he had bought 4 viscose woolen blankets, rope and string, nails, glue, a few tools, matches, though he intended in due course to make a fire drill, some pots and pans, 2 dozen packets of seeds, and 10 kilograms of wheat flour. No, not synthetic starch and cotton waste flour substitute, he had insisted, even though it is more nourishing. But when it came to pan-glandular biscuits and vitaminized beef surrogate, he had not been able to resist the shopman's persuasion. Looking at the tins now, he bitterly reproached himself for his weakness. Loathsome, civilized stuff. He had made up his mind that he would never eat it, even if he were starving. That'll teach them, he thought vindictively. It would also teach him. He counted his money. The little that remained would be enough, he hoped, to tide him over the winter. By next spring his garden would be producing enough to make him independent of the outside world. Meanwhile, there would always be game. He had seen plenty of rabbits, and there were waterfowl on the ponds. He set to work at once to make bow and arrows. There were ash trees near the lighthouse, and for arrow shafts a whole copse full of beautiful straight hazel saplings. He began by felling a young ash, cutting out 6 of unbranched stem, stripped off the bark, and, paring by paring, shaved away the white wood, as old Mitsima had taught him, until he had a stave of his own height, stiff at the thickened center, lively and quick at the slender tips. The work gave him an intense pleasure. After those weeks of idleness in London, with nothing to do, whenever he wanted anything but to press or switch or turn a handle, it was pure delight to be doing something that demanded skill and patience. He had almost finished whittling the stave into shape when he realized with a start that he was singing. It was as though stumbling upon himself from the outside. He had suddenly caught himself out, taken himself flagrantly at fault. Guiltily he blushed. After all, it was not to sing and enjoy himself that he had come here. It was to escape further contamination by the filth of civilized life. It was to be purified and made good. It was actively to make amends. He realized to his dismay that, absorbed in the whittling of his bow, he had forgotten what he had sworn to himself he would constantly remember. Poor Linda, and his own murderous unkindness to her, and those loathsome twins swarming like lice around the mystery of her death, insulting with their presence not merely his own grief and repentance, but the very gods themselves. He had sworn to remember, he had sworn unceasingly to make amends, and there he was, sitting happily over his bow stave, singing, actually singing. He went indoors, opened the box of mustard and put some water to boil on the fire. Half an hour later, 3 Delta- land workers from one of the Puttenham-Bokanovsky groups happened to be driving to Elstead, and at the top of the hill were astonished to see a young man standing outside the abandoned lighthouse, stripped to the waist and hitting himself with a whip of knotted cords. His back was horizontally streaked with crimson, and from wheel to wheel ran the trickles of blood. The driver of the lorry pulled up at the side of the road, and, with his 2 companions, stared open-mouthed at the extraordinary spectacle. 1, 2, 3. They counted the strokes. After the 8th, the young man interrupted his self-punishment to run to the wood's edge and there be violently sick. When he had finished, he picked up the whip and began hitting himself again. 9, 10, 11. "Fourth," whispered the driver, and his twins were of the same opinion. 40, they said. 3 days later, like turkey buzzards, said duck. I don't know, guys. 3 days later, like turkey buzzards set up on a corpse, the reporters came. Dried and hardened over a slow fire of green wood, the bow was ready. The savage was busy on his arrows. 30 hazel sticks had been whittled and dried, tipped with sharp nails, carefully nocked. He had made a raid one night on the Puttingham poultry farm, and now had feathers enough to equip a whole armory. It was at work upon the feathering of his shafts that the first of the reporters found him. Noiseless on his pneumatic shoes, the man came up behind him. "Good morning, Mr. Savage," he said. "I am the representative of the hourly radio." Startled, as though by the bite of a snake, the savage sprang to his feet, scattering arrows, feathers, glue pot, and brush in all directions. "I beg your pardon," said the reporter with genuine compunction. "I had no intention." He touched his hat, the aluminium stovepipe hat in which he carried his wireless receiver and transmitter. "Excuse my not taking it off," he said. "It's a bit heavy. Well, as I was saying, I am the representative of the hourly—" "What do you want?" asked the savage, scowling. The reporter returned his most ingratiating smile. "Well, of course, our readers would be profoundly interested." He put his head on one side, his smile became almost coquettish. "Just a few words from you, Mr. Savage." And rapidly, with a series of ritual gestures, he uncoiled 2 wires connected to the portable battery buckled round his waist, plugged them simultaneously into the sides of his aluminium hat, touched the spring on the crown, and antenna shot up into the air, touched another spring on the peak of the brim, and, like a jack-in-the-box, out jumped the microphone and hung there, quivering, 6 inches in front of his nose, pulled down a pair of receivers over his ears, pressed the switch on the left side of the hat, and from within came a faint, raspy buzzing. Turned the knob on the right, and the buzzing was interrupted by a stethoscopic wheeze and cackle, by hiccoughs and sudden squeaks. "Hello?" he said to the microphone. "Hello?" A bell suddenly rang inside his head. "Is that you, Edzo?" Primo Melon speaking. "Yes, I've got hold of him. Mr. Savage will now take the microphone and say a few words. Won't you, Mr. Savage?" He looked up at the Savage with another of those winning smiles of his. "Just tell our readers why you came here. What made you leave London?" "Hold on, Etzel." So very suddenly. And, of course, that whip. The Savage started. How did they know about the whip? We're all crazy to know about the whip. And then something about civilization. You know, the sort of stuff. What I think of the civilized girl. Just a few words. The savage obeyed with a disconcerting literalness. 5 words he uttered, and no more. 5 words. The same as those he said to Bernard about the arch-community songster of Canterbury. Hani sons eso tsena. And seizing the reporter by the shoulder, he spun him around. The young man revealed himself invitingly well covered, aimed, and with all the force and accuracy of a champion foot and mouth baller, delivered a most prodigious kick. 8 minutes later, a new edition of the hourly radio was on scale in the streets of London. Hourly radio reporter has coccyx kicked by Mystery Savage, ran the headline on the front page. Sensation in Surrey. Sensation even in London, thought the reporter when, on his return, he read the words. And a very painful sensation, what was more. He sat down gingerly to his luncheon. Hold on, guys. Undeterred by that cautionary bruise on their colleagues' coccyx, 4 other reporters representing the New York Times, the Frankfurt 4-dimensional continuum, the Fortean Science Monitor, and the Delta Mirror, called that afternoon at the lighthouse and met with receptions of progressively increasing violence. From a safe distance and still rubbing his buttocks, "Benighted fool," shouted the man from the Fortean Science Monitor, "why don't you take Soma?" "Get away!" the savage shook his fist. The other retreated a few steps, then turned round again. "Evil's an unreality if you take a couple of grams." "Kohakwa Iyatokia." The tone was menacingly derisive. "Pain's a delusion." "Oh, is it?" said the savage, picking up a thick hazel switch, strode forward. The man from the Fortean Science Monitor made a dash for his helicopter. After that the savage was left for a time in peace. A few helicopters came and hovered inquisitively round the tower. He shot an arrow into the importunately nearest of them. It pierced the aluminium floor of the cabin. There was a shrill yell, and the machine went rocketing up into the air with all the acceleration that its supercharger could give it. The others, in future, kept their distance respectfully. Ignoring their tiresome humming, he likened himself in his imagination to one of the suitors of the Maiden of Matsaki, unmoved and persistent among the winged vermin. The savage dug at what was to be his garden. After a time, the vermin evidently became bored and flew away. For hours at a stretch the sky above his head was empty, but for the larks, silent. The weather was breathlessly hot. There was thunder in the air. He had dug all the morning and was resting, stretched out along the floor, and suddenly the thought of Lenina was a real presence, naked and tangible, saying, "Sweet," and "Put your arms round me," in shoes and socks, perfumed. Impudent trumpet, but oh, her arms round his neck, the lifting of her breasts, her mouth. Eternity was in our lips and eyes. Lenina, no, no! He sprang to his feet and, half naked as he was, ran out of the house. At the edge of the heath stood a clump of hoary juniper bushes. He flung himself against them. He embraced, not the smooth body of his desires, but an armful of green spikes. Sharp, with 1,000 points, they pricked him. He tried to think of poor Linda, breathless and dumb, with her clutching hands and the unutterable terror in her eyes. Poor Linda, whom he had sworn to remember, but it was still the presence of Lenina that haunted him. Lenina, whom he had promised to forget. Even though the stab and sting of the juniper needles, his winching flesh was aware of her, unescapably real. Sweet? Sweet. And if you wanted me to, why didn't you? The whip was hanging on a nail by the door, ready to hand against the arrival of reporters. In a frenzy the savage ran back to the house, seized it, whirled it. The knotted corbett bit into his flesh. "Strumpet, strumpet," he shouted, at every blow as though it were Lenina. And how frantically, without knowing it, he wished it were. White, warm, scented, infamous Lenina that he was dogging thus. Strumpet, and then, in a voice of despair, "Linda, forgive me. God, I'm bad, I'm wicked. No, no, you strumpet." From his carefully constructed hide in the woods 300 meters away, Darwin Bonaparte, the Feely Corporation's most expert big game photographer, had watched the whole proceedings. Patience and skill had been rewarded. He had spent 3 days sitting inside the bole of an artificial oak tree, 3 nights crawling on his belly through the heather, hiding microphones in gorse bushes, burying wires in the soft grey sand. 72 hours of profound discomfort. But now the great moment had come, the greatest. Darwin Bonaparte had time to reflect as he moved among his instruments. The greatest thing, no, the greatest since his taking of the famous all-howling stereoscopic Feely of the gorillas. Wedding. Splendid, he said to himself as the savage started his astonishing performance. Splendid. He kept his telescope cameras carefully aimed, glued to their moving objective, clapped on a higher power to get a close-up of the frantic and distorted face. Admirable. Switched over for half a minute to slow motion, an exquisitely comical effect, he promised himself. Listened in, meanwhile, to the blows, the groans, the wild and raving words that were being recorded on the soundtrack at the edge of his film. Tried the effect of a little amplification. Yes, that was decidedly better. Was delighted to hear, in a momentary lull, the shrill singing of a lark. Wished the savage would turn round so that he could get a good close-up of the blood on his back. And almost instantly, what astonishing luck, the accommodating fellow did turn round, and he was able to take a perfect close-up. Well, that was grand, he said to himself when it was all over. Really grand. He mopped his face. When they had put in the Feely effects at studio, it would be a wonderful film. Almost as good, thought Darwin Bonaparte, as the sperm whale's love life, and that, by Ford, was saying a good deal. 12 days later, the Savage of Surrey had been released and could be seen, heard and felt in every first-class Feely palace in Western Europe. The effect of Darwin Bonaparte's film was immediate and enormous. On the afternoon which followed the evening of its release, John's rustic solitude was suddenly broken by the arrival overhead of a great swarm of helicopters. He was digging in his garden, digging too in his own mind, laboriously turning up the substance of his thought, death, and he drove in his spade once and again and yet again, and all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death. A convincing thunder rumbled through the words. He lifted another spadeful of earth. Why had Linda died? Why had she been allowed to become gradually less than human and at last? He shuddered. A good kissing carry-on. He planted his foot on his spade and stamped it fiercely into the tough ground. As fly to wanton boys are we to the gods. They kill us for their sport. Thunder again, words that proclaim themselves true, truer somehow than truth itself, and yet that same Gloucester had called them every gentle gods. Besides, they best of rest is sleep, and that thou oft provokest, yet grossly fearest thy death, which is no more than sleep. Sleep, perchance to dream. His spade struck against a stone. He stooped to pick it up, for in that sleep of death, what dreams? A humming overhead had become a roar, and suddenly he was in shadow. There was something between the sun and him. He looked up, startled from his digging, from his thoughts, looked up in a dazzled bewilderment, his mind still wandering in that other world of truer than truth, still focused on the immensities of death and deity, looked up and saw, close above him, the swarm of hovering machines. Like locusts they came, hung poised, descended all around him on the heather, and from out of the bellies of these giant grasshoppers stepped men in white viscose flannels, women, for the weather was hot, in acetate shantung pyjamas or velveteen shorts and sleeveless, half-unzipped singlet ones, couple from each. In a few minutes there were dozens of them, standing in a wide circle round the lighthouse, staring, laughing, clicking their cameras, throwing, as to an ape, peanuts, packets of sex hormone chewing gum, panglandular petit beurres, and every moment, for across the hog's back the stream of traffic now flowed unceasingly, their numbers increased. As in a nightmare, the dozens became scores, the scores hundreds. The savage had retreated towards cover, and now, in the posture of an animal at bay, stood with his back to the wall of the lighthouse, staring from face to face in speechless horror, like a man out of his senses. From this stupor he was aroused to a more immediate sense of reality by the impact of his cheek of a well-aimed packet of chewing gum. A shock of startling pain, and he was broad awake and fiercely angry. "Go away!" he shouted. The ape had spoken. There was a burst of laughter and hand-clapping. "Good old savage! Hooray!" And through the babble he heard cries of, "Whip! The whip!" Acting on the word's suggestion, he seized a bunch of knotted cords from its nail behind the door and shook it at his tormentors. There was a yell of ironical applause. Menacingly he advanced towards them. A woman cried out in fear. The line wavered at its most immediately threatened point, then stiffened again, stood firm. The consciousness of being in overwhelming force had given these sightseers a courage which the savage had not expected of them. Taken aback, he halted and looked around. "Why don't you leave me alone?" There was an almost plaintive note in his anger. "Have a few magnesium-salted almonds," said the man who, if the savage were to advance, would be the first to be attacked. He held out a packet. "They're really very good, you know," he added with a rather nervous smile of propitiation? No clue, guys. "And the magnesium salts will help to keep you young." The savage ignored his offer. "What do you want with me?" he asked, turning from one grinning face to another. "What do you want with me?" "The whip," answered 100 voices confusedly. "Do the whipping stunt. Let's see the whipping stunt." Then, in unison and a slow, heavy rhythm, "We want the whip," shouted a group at the end of the line. "We want the whip." Others at once took up the cry, and the phrase was repeated, parrot fashion, again and again, with an ever-growing volume and sound, until, by the 7th or 8th reiteration, no other words was being spoken. "We want the whip." They were all crying together, and, intoxicated by the noise, the unanimity, the sense of rhythmical atonement, they might, it seemed, have gone on for hours, almost indefinitely. But at about the 25th repetition, the proceedings were startlingly interrupted. Yet another helicopter had arrived from across the Hog's Back, hung poised above the crowd, then dropped within a few yards of where the savage was standing, in an open space between the line of sightseers and the lighthouse. The roar of the air screws momentarily drowned the shouting. Then, as the machine touched the ground and the engines were turned off, "We want the whip," broke out again in the same loud, insistent monotone. The door of the helicopter opened, and out stepped first a fair and ruddy-faced young man, then in green velveteen shorts, white shirt, and jockey cap, a young woman. At the sight of the young woman the savage started, recoiled, turned pale. The young woman stood, smiling at him, an uncertain, imploring, almost abject smile. The seconds passed. Her lips moved. She was saying something, but the sound of her voice was covered by the loud, reiterated refrain of the sightseers. We want the whip. The young woman pressed both hands to her left side, and on that peach-bright, dull, beautiful face of hers appeared a strangely incongruous expression of yearning distress. Her blue eyes seemed to grow larger, brighter, and suddenly 2 tears down her cheek. Inaudibly she spoke again, then with a quick, impassioned gesture stretched out her arms towards the savage, stepped forward. We want the whip. And all of a sudden they had what they wanted. Strumpet, the savage, had rushed at her like a madman. Fichu, like a madman, he was slashing at her with his whip of small cords. Terrified, she had turned to flee, had tripped and fallen in the heather. Henry, Henry, she shouted, but her ruddy-faced companion had bolted out of harm's way behind the helicopter. With a whoop of delighted excitement, the line broke. There was a convergent stampede towards the magnetic center of attraction. Pain was a fascinating horror. Fry, lechery, fry! Frenzied, the savage slashed again. Hungrily, they gathered round, pushing and scrambling like swine about the trough. Oh, the flesh! The savage ground his teeth. This time it was on his shoulders that the whip descended. Kill it! Drawn by the fascination of the horror of pain and, from within, impelled by the habit of cooperation, that desire for unanimity and atonement, which their conditioning had so ineradicably implanted in them, they began to mime the frenzy of his gestures, striking at one another as the savage struck at his own rebellious flesh, or at that plump incarnation of turpitude writhing in the heather at his feet. Kill it! The savage went on shouting. Then suddenly somebody started singing, Orgy Porgy, and in a moment they had all caught up the refrain, and singing had begun to dance. Orgy Porgy, round and round and round, beating one another in 6/8 time. Orgy Porgy. It was after midnight when the last of the helicopters took its flight. Stupefied by soma and exhausted by a long-drawn frenzy of sensuality, the savage lay sleeping in the heather. The sun was already high when he awoke. He lay for a moment, blinking in owlish incomprehension at the light, then suddenly remembering everything. Oh my God! He covered his eyes with his hand. That evening the swarm of helicopters had come buzzing across the Hawk's back was a dark cloud 10 kilometers long. The description of last night's orgy of atonement had been in all papers. Savage called the first arrivals as they alighted from their machines. Mr. Savage. There was no answer. The door of the lighthouse was ajar. They pushed it open and walked into a shuttered twilight. Through an archway on the further side of the room, they could see the bottom of a staircase that led up to the higher floors. Just under the crown of the arch dangled a pair of feet. Savage! Mr. Savage! Slowly, very slowly, like 2 unhurried compass needles, the feet turned towards the right, north, northeast, east, southeast, then paused after a few seconds, turned as hurriedly back towards the left. southwest, south, southeast, east. And that's it, guys. So that's about nice timing. We've only got a few minutes left, which means that next week we can do something else. And I'm thinking of a Brave New World Revisited. Thanks for the retweets at Real Liberty Media. Check them out at reallibertymedia.com. At the top of the hour, there will be a live show there. And it's called The Dork Table. It's another one of those shows where you can call in and take over the airwaves if you like. It starts at noon Eastern time. And I'm thinking, I'm not quite sure, but usually Grants is there and Flash will be there. And you can listen to some radio at which you know that these people making the radio have at least gone through the same consciousness shift that you have, and so it doesn't really matter what they talk about because you know they come from the same background, so to speak. You know, not that I'm saying that all their topics are unimportant or something, but what I'm saying is that it doesn't matter what the topic is because you know that these people have gone through the same change as you have. Well, dare call it waking up. Thanks, Juana Taco. Thanks for listening. I guess I'll see you in a couple of minutes. And thanks for listening, everybody else. I'll be back next week. I'm not quite sure what we're going to do. The 24th, I have Melody Hellathon, so make sure you catch that. I hope she likes being on air. It was a long time ago that I heard her speak, so I'm looking forward to that. This is UCY.tv. This has been the Solvinur Event without any ads. So check out the website UCY.tv and that button. Thanks for listening, everybody. See you guys next week.
I think a new world order is emerging.
An inside job? How dare you? How dare you?
To create, so to say, mass-produced models of human beings arranged in some kind of scientific process.
This is Ozzy Skateboard, and you're listening to UCY.